with all the drill baby drill and all the other things going on in the world, who controls the price of oil? I thought, is it Joe Byron with the I did that? Is it Donald Trump with the I did that? Is it OPEC? Is it the United States? What controls the price of oil? And this led me down a rabbit hole. Its original names were naphtha, asphalt, and bitumen. Eventually, you switched out for the word petroleum, which is a word that comes from monasteries in southern Italy. And the earliest use cases that we saw were the Sumerians used bitumen to make their boats right here. They also used asphalt to construct the towers of Babylon. And China used gas wells to burn brine to create salt as early as 347 AD. But I mean, the earliest use cases were about 4,000 years ago with the Towers of Babylon and the Sumerian boat. But nobody really got the oil portion of it down until the 1850s. And then we have James Young, who made coal oil to basically lube up his machines and make lamps. He was a guy from Derbyshire, Scotland. And then we also have Abraham Pinot Gesner from Nova Scotia, Canada, who basically made the first kerosene empire. He used kerosene to light all of Nova Scotia's streets and eventually got down to um, the United States. But probably the most important person on here is Edwin Drake, who is credited with making the first oil well out in Titusville, Pennsylvania. And with that, like that kind of started what we now refer to as the age of oil. So that so making the combustion engine along with better oil drilling techniques started the modern age of just making machines fast and moving things faster. Right after Edwin Drake made the first oil well, John Rockefeller created Standard Oil. And John Rockefeller is an absolute rock star. He is credited with being the world's first billionaire. He created Standard Oil in 1870, and he ran it all the way until he retired in 1897. At its peak, Standard Oil controlled 90% of all the U.S. oil. Eventually, though, in 1911, the United States decided that he had a monopoly on everything and he had to break up Standard Oil into 34 separate companies. But the biggest ones we have listed here. The most relevant ones basically just being Standard Oil of New Jersey, Standard Oil of New York, California, Kentucky. But you can actually see as time went on, they basically just remerged into four of the big ones that we see today: Chevron, Exxon, BP, and Marathon. But his companies would become more relevant in a little bit. 1892, Edward Lawrence Domy, pictured right here, created the first LA oil fields, which like made a huge boom, moving Southern California into becoming like a modern city. On top of that, uh, at the same time, a Wheeler #1 oil well was first made in Oklahoma near Drumright. Despite looking it up, the oil well is not doesn't have a picture, so we have the when it in 1987 it became a historical place listed on the National Historical Registry. So we have a picture of its plaque for the National Historic Registry. And at the same time, we also had in 1901 in Spindletop, Texas, they found the largest field of oil in the world at the time in Texas at Spindletop, which we can see right here on the left. So combining with Oklahoma, California, Texas, and the Standard Oil breakups, basically the U.S. is completely dominating the market by the 1930s. And this is, but before we go any further, we have to ask, what is a cartel? And when I say cartel, you might be thinking of like a Colombian cartels that are infamous for drug trafficking, like Pablo down here or the Office remake we got going on. But really, a cartel is a group of independent market participants who collude with each other and agree to not compete with each other in order to improve their profits and dominate the market. And this is very relevant because the first cartel that we see in modern history would be called the Seven Sisters Oil Cartel. Basically, these are all the spin-offs from Standard Oil. And they consist of the Anglo-Persian Oil Company, which is BP, the Gulf Oil, which will later become Chevron, Shell Oil, Standard Oil of California, Standard Oil of New Jersey, which is Exxon, Standard Oil of New York, which is Mobil, and Texaco. They basically signed contracts with everybody in the Middle East to control all of their oil while they were still private companies. And at their peak in the late 1960s, they controlled 85% of the world's oil. As the Middle East found that these seven sisters controlled 85% of the oil, they nationalized the oil. So instead of having it be in private hands, it's all the oil switched over to state-run companies. And these, the most relevant ones were OPEC, which was founded on September 14th, 1960 by Iran, Iraq, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, and Venezuela. And they became the new cartel of oil pricing. So basically, right up until the 1972, all oil prices were controlled by the Seven Sisters cartel, and now 1973 hits, or 1960s, the OPEC is created to take back control to the countries that actually own all the oil: Iran, Iraq, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, and Venezuela. And over the 1960s to 1973, they OPEC regains control of most of the world's oil. And while I'm sitting here calling OPEC a cartel, members prefer to describe themselves as a modest force for market stabilization, citing that it was founded to offset the Seven Sisters cartel of multinational oil companies. It's a big debate on whether or not OPEC is a cartel or not. Ultimately, I think they fit the definition, so I'm going to keep calling them a cartel. But using their newfound power, now that they control the oil industry, OPEC announced an oil embargo on all countries that supported Israel during the 1973 Yom Kippur War, which was when Saudi Arabia and Egypt attacked Israel to take them over, ultimately being unsuccessful. And when they said that they were placing an oil embargo on all countries that supported Israel, these countries were the United States, Canada, Japan, the Netherlands, and the United Kingdom. But by the time the embargo was lifted a year later, oil had gone from $3 to $12, a 300% increase, and this caused a huge gas shortage in the United States, where we can see these huge long lines. And then on top of that, in 1979, there was the Iranian Revolution, which decreased the oil output of both Iran and Iraq, causing oil to go up 100% again. And now we're talking $40 a barrel in the 1980s. And we can actually see the how it affected Iran and Saudi Arabia in the as soon as 1973 hits, just plummets, and 1979 plummets even more. Over the next 20 years, oil basically became pretty stagnant. In 1983, the U.S. introduced oil futures. Oil prices had gotten very dramatic because the U.S. got off the gold standard in 1969, which caused the USD to plummet. And then for a little bit, oil prices were all over the place. And then OPEC decided to price barrels of oil using gold for basically a decade until oil futures were created by the US in 1983, which stabilized the prices and basically kept everything sideways for 2 decades. So over time, there's been a question of how can OPEC work long term? And when we talk about OPEC's conflicts, there's the Yom Kippur War, which started the 1973 oil crisis. Basically, just Egypt and Saudi Arabia attacking Israel. We can see just highlights of that right here. Then there was the Iraqi occupation of Kuwait, which those are two OPEC countries hurting each other for some reason. We can also tie in 9/11 and the occupation of Iraq with OPEC's different OPEC things. There's the Libyan crisis. All these things happening within the OPEC countries dramatically changes how oil and other things are priced over these next 20 years from 1990 to 2010. Then around 2017, OPEC Plus is introduced. OPEC Plus is 11 more countries that participate in OPEC with initiatives like supply cuts to bind global supply and give more leverage on oil prices. And these countries are Russia, Brazil, Mexico, Malaysia, Sudan, South Sudan, Oman, Kazakhstan, Brunei, Brian, and Azerbaijan. I don't know how to say the last one, but we can see them in these dark red places, or these lighter places here. The dark countries being the original OPEC. All the way up until 2020, from 1973 to 2020, OPEC has been able to use oil to threaten other countries as well as drive the supply up and down to change the price of oil based off of what OPEC wants to do. So all the way up until 2020, cartels have controlled all of the prices of oil, whether it was the Seven Sisters cartel or the OPEC cartel. Cartels are only controlling oil. So as of 2020, a dramatic shift occurs, though. In 2020, the United States became a total petroleum exporter after developing its fracking and horizontal drilling techniques in the Dakotas and Texas, and which ultimately relieves some of the chokehold that OPEC has caused because they output so much more oil now. Uh, OPEC deciding to lower or raise the total supply doesn't matter as much. But then on top of that, at the peak of COVID in March and April of 2020, demand for crude oil plummeted. As you can recall, the whole entire world shut down in the middle of March of 2020. Basically meant nobody was driving. And in the middle of all that, an oil price war between Russia and Saudi Arabia, both OPEC Plus members, they increased their production. And then now there's a huge supply and a very low demand. And this all came to heads on April 20th, 2020, where for a brief moment, futures prices of oils went negative to 37.63 a barrel. So that ultimately meant with no demand and storage at a premium, if you got any oil futures contracts those days, they were literally paying you to take delivery. So oil producers were paying you thousands of dollars to take a contract in the hopes that you would 100,000 barrels of oil when they finally sell them and settle. As soon as that happened, there's a dramatic shift. As soon as 2020 ended, there's a dramatic shift across the entire world because one, that apparently oil can go negative. So that was a first because it seemed like the futures contracts were not in line with what OPEC wanted to do. So it was possible to have real prices on oil. And then second, the rest of the world realized that they can't be completely dependent on foreign oil reserves if another COVID was to happen. So that's why you suddenly see Canada and China rounding out the top five, neither of which are in OPEC. So who controls the price of oil? We do. Oil's futures contracts are finally, after 120 years of cartels controlling oil prices in the last 4 years, between actual competition of countries finally outproducing OPEC and oil futures finally getting loose of that foothold that OPEC had on supply and demand. The people of the world and the free market controls the oil futures prices. Finally, we are not controlled by a cartel. We did it, Reddit. But yeah, that's current day oil prices. So that'll be interesting too as time goes on, because if we're going to do this drill baby drill, that means the United States oil production is going to go up like crazy too.